That night changed everything in the most unexpected way. It all started with a request from my stepmother, Lillian Stanford, to stay home while my father, Harry Stanford, went on his usual fishing trip. For Lillian and me, it had become a sort of tradition to spend time together when Dad was away. But that evening, everything went differently. Our home in Morristown, New Jersey, was unusually quiet. The usually cozy family mansion felt foreign to me. Dad had left early in the morning, and a strange silence enveloped the house, clinging to the walls like a heavy blanket. I had just finished the final touches on my schoolwork and was about to relax when I heard her voice. "Jason, please come downstairs to the living room. I need your help." I hesitated but eventually went downstairs. Lillian was sitting on the couch in her elegant silk blouse, her gaze fixed on the window as if she were somewhere far away. I felt a strange unease creep inside me. "What happened?" I asked, trying not to show that her worry had gotten to me. She turned her head and smiled, but her eyes didn't. There was a new depth in them that I couldn't understand. "Just sit with me," she said, patting the cushion next to her. I sat down, leaving a small distance between us. There was something in her gaze that made my heart race faster. It was unfamiliar, alien, and I didn't know how to behave. "You know, you've changed so much lately," she said, her voice light, but each word fell like a heavy stone into the space between us. "No longer a boy." I tried to smile, but my mouth wouldn't cooperate. Those words were strange, too personal to sound so casual. "Thanks, I guess," I mumbled, trying to ease the situation. Lillian leaned back on the couch, her eyes scanning my face. I felt like I was under a microscope. "We rarely talk honestly, Jason," she said softly. "I feel like sometimes we can be closer than this." The word closer hung in the air, heavy like a storm about to break. I leaned back, trying to ignore the growing tension between us. The next few days after that conversation with Lillian passed in strange silence. Every time I was in her presence, I felt the tension between us growing. It was almost tangible, like an invisible barrier that we both knew about but avoided discussing. Dad was still on his fishing trip, as usual, and the house felt empty despite our presence. That Friday evening, I found myself alone in my room again. I tried to focus on watching movies, but my thoughts kept returning to Lillian. Her voice, her gaze. It all seemed to have taken root in my mind, as if trying to say something. I dismissed these thoughts, convincing myself that I was just imagining something absurd. But by night, the house fell silent again. I heard her footsteps downstairs and the sound of the TV playing softly in the living room. It seemed like the silence itself was calling me out. I went downstairs, trying to do it as quietly as possible. Downstairs, Lillian was sitting on the couch with a glass of wine in her hand. Her gaze was fixed on the screen, but I couldn't tell if she was watching the movie or lost in her thoughts. She didn't notice me right away, or maybe she was just pretending. When her eyes met mine, I felt a chill run through me. "Can't sleep?" she asked with a slight smile, but her voice sounded too casual. "Yeah," I replied, feeling the words catch in my throat. I sat down in the chair across from her, trying to keep my distance. We sat in silence, broken only by the soft sound of the TV. But that silence was too loud, too significant. I wanted to say something to break the atmosphere, but I didn't know what. "Are you thinking about what happened?" she suddenly asked, not taking her eyes off the glass in her hands. I froze. Did she understand? My heart skipped a beat, but I decided to pretend I didn't understand. "What do you mean?" I replied, trying to sound calm. She put the glass on the table and turned to me. Her eyes looked straight into mine, as if trying to see deep inside. "We can't keep pretending that nothing has changed, Jason," she said softly. Her words hit me like thunder on a clear day. I felt like the world around me was crumbling. "Lillian, this is crazy," I began, my voice trembling. "You're my stepmother. We can't even think about something like this." She stood up, taking a step towards me. Her expression was strangely calm, but there was a determination burning in her eyes. "Why can't we?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "We're both adults. We can decide what's right for us." Those words, so simple yet so dangerous, left me speechless. I felt the tension between us rising again, and despite my protests, I couldn't take my eyes off her face. Saturday brought a heavy, sticky atmosphere, as if the whole house was permeated with tension that was becoming almost unbearable. Dad was at a corporate event and wasn't planning to return until late evening. This left Lillian and me alone in the house, filled with a silence that grew louder with each passing hour. I decided to hide in the kitchen, doing something mundane to distract myself. I was standing by the stove, stirring the sauce for pasta, when I heard her footsteps. She approached quietly, as always, but I felt her presence even before I turned around. "Jason, are you still cooking?" she asked softly. Her voice was as casual as ever, but there was a note in it that made my heart skip a beat. "Yeah, almost done," I replied, trying to focus on the pot in front of me. My hands were slightly trembling, and I hoped she wouldn't notice. She came closer, too close, and I felt her warmth, as if she deliberately invaded my personal space. I stepped back, but that didn't change the fact that she was standing right there. "You're tense?" she said, leaning against the kitchen counter. Her voice was so soft that it seemed to crawl under my skin. "No, I'm fine," I mumbled, even though I knew it sounded unconvincing. Lillian silently looked at me, as if studying me, before suddenly reaching out and placing her hand on mine. Her touch was light, almost innocent, but it was enough to send a shiver through my entire body. I abruptly pulled my hand away, but she didn't remove hers, her eyes still fixed on mine. "We need to talk," she said, her voice resolute. "We can't avoid this anymore." "Lillian, please stop," I said, trying to maintain some composure. "We can't." She took a step towards me, closing the distance between us to a minimum. Her gaze was penetrating, and her voice held a strange mix of strength and tenderness. "But why? Why do we have to pretend this doesn't exist? You feel it, and so do I. Why can't we just be honest with ourselves?" I closed my eyes, trying to block out her words, but they had already seeped inside, like a poisonous whisper. "This is wrong," I replied, even though my voice sounded unconvincing. "We can't. We shouldn't. But it's already happening, Jason," she whispered, her voice low and intense. "We can't stop what has already begun." I wanted to argue, to step back, to run out of the room, but something inside me made me stay. Before I could think, her hand gently brushed my cheek. That touch was too intimate, too personal to pretend nothing was happening. I felt the walls I had built around myself beginning to crumble. She took another step forward, her face now so close to mine that I could feel her breath on my skin. "Tell me you don't want this," she whispered. "Tell me, and I'll stop." My lips parted to voice a protest, but no words came out. The moment stretched, and I felt an invisible force pulling us together. Before I knew it, my lips met hers. That kiss was intense and charged, like lightning splitting the sky. Everything else disappeared, leaving only the two of us in that moment. My heart was racing, and my mind was trying to grasp what I was doing, but I couldn't stop. When we finally pulled away, I was breathing heavily, unable to meet her gaze. Her face was still so close, her eyes burning with an intense, inexplicable emotion. I understood that this was a moment after which there would be no turning back. "We shouldn't have done this," I whispered, even though my words sounded weak and powerless. "Maybe," she replied, her voice soft but full of certainty. "But we did." After our lips parted, time seemed to freeze. The room seemed to stand still, but I could hear every detail. The ticking of the clock on the wall, the rustling of the wind outside, the sound of my own breathing. Lillian stood very close, her gaze fixed on mine, her lips still slightly parted. I stepped back, feeling my pulse racing in my chest. "Lillian, this was a mistake," I managed to say, but my words sounded more like a plea than a statement. "A mistake?" she echoed, her voice filled with a strange mix of pain and challenge. "Why do you think that, Jason? Because it's wrong? Or because you're afraid to admit that this is what you wanted?" Her words struck a deep chord within me. I wanted to argue, to push her away, to run out of the room, but instead, I stood there, as if glued to the spot. "I don't know what I feel," I admitted honestly, avoiding her gaze. "All of this, it's too much." She took a step forward, and I felt her warmth. "You do know," she whispered, and there was a gentleness in her voice that made my heart ache. "You're just afraid. But you don't need to be afraid, Jason. I'm here." Her words were both soothing and terrifying. I closed my eyes, trying to deal with the chaos raging in my head. "You're my stepmother, Lillian. We can't. This is wrong." "Did you make that up? Or is that what you've been taught?" she asked, her voice filled with challenge. "Why do you let others decide what's right and what's wrong?" Those words, so simple yet so complex, echoed in my mind. I wanted to argue, but I felt that any defense would be shattered by her certainty. The next day, I avoided Lillian as much as possible. I locked myself in my room, trying to sort out my thoughts. The phone rang, but I didn't answer. Music turned up to the max couldn't drown out the memory of the kiss. By evening, I finally went downstairs. I knew Dad was supposed to return from the event, and I hoped his presence would help bring things back to normal. But in the living room, only Lillian was waiting for me. She was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a warm blanket, reading a book. Her gaze lifted as soon as I entered. She smiled, softly, almost tenderly, but there was something in her eyes that made me stop. "Dad isn't back yet?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "He's running late," she replied, putting the book down. "But we both know you came down here not because of him." Her directness caught me off guard. I froze, not knowing how to respond. I just wanted to make sure everything was okay," I mumbled. She stood up and walked towards me, her movements slow and almost graceful. "Everything is okay, Jason. Just don't run away." "I'm not running away," I lied, even though we both knew it wasn't true. Lillian took another step closer, closing the distance between us to a minimum. Her gaze was penetrating, and her voice became almost a whisper. "You think about me, don't you? Every time you close your eyes. Every time you try to pretend nothing happened." I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the words stuck in my throat. She knew, and I knew she was right. The following days were filled with strange tension. Every time I encountered Lillian in the kitchen, the living room, or even just passing by, I felt a vibration between us, like a taut string. We didn't talk about what had happened. The words remained in the past, but the silence screamed louder than any conversation. Dad returned on Sunday evening. His loud, familiar laughter broke the tension in the house, and for a moment, I felt relieved. I hid behind his presence, hoping he would be a wall between Lillian and me. She seemed to understand this, and her behavior changed. She became that Lillian I knew again, caring, attentive, the stepmother who couldn't be faulted. But it was all just a mask. A few days later, Dad stayed late at work, and I was left alone with Lillian again. I tried to avoid her, sitting in my room and listening to music, but at some point, hunger drove me downstairs. She was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. Her hair was tied in a messy bun, and she held the knife confidently against the cutting board. She noticed me but didn't say a word, just a quick glance in my direction, and then silence again. I walked to the fridge, trying not to meet her gaze, but I could feel her presence sharply, as if she were standing an inch away from me. "Want to help?" she suddenly asked, not looking up. No, I'm just going to grab something to eat, I mumbled, reaching for an apple. I was about to leave, but her voice stopped me. Jason. I turned around. She was looking straight at me, and in her eyes was a mix of pain and determination. We need to talk. I wanted to argue, to say there was nothing to talk about, but her tone left no room for objection. I sat down at the kitchen table, placing the apple in front of me like a shield. I don't know how we can keep living like this, pretending nothing happened, she said, her voice soft but firm. I feel like every day we're walking on a knife's edge. I feel that too, I admitted, even though my words sounded weaker than I intended. She exhaled, as if she had been waiting for this admission, and took a step towards me. Then why can't we just be honest? Because it's wrong, Lillian, I said sharply, standing up. Because this could ruin everything. She didn't flinch. Instead, she took another step closer. Jason, this is already ruining us. Don't you see? We're already on the brink. And all that's left is to either step forward or retreat. I ran a hand over my face, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. What do you want from me? I asked, my voice trembling. I don't know, she replied, her eyes filled with tears. But I know I can't keep pretending I don't feel anything. Those words stuck in my head all evening. I sat in my room trying to sort out my thoughts, but none of them brought any relief. Everything felt wrong, but I couldn't shake the feeling that her words were true. We were on the brink of something irreversible. Late at night, when the house was quiet again, I heard her footsteps outside my door. She knocked. Can I come in? She asked softly. I wanted to say no, but instead, I replied, yes. She entered, closing the door behind her, and stood by the doorway. Her face was serious, but in her eyes was a strange mix of determination and vulnerability. I just wanted to say, if you want me to leave, I will, but if not, I want to know how you truly feel. My voice caught in my throat. This was the moment of truth, and I wasn't ready. I don't know, I finally said. I don't know how to stop this, but I know it's wrong. Her lips trembled, as if she was about to say something but then changed her mind. She nodded and slowly left the room, leaving me alone in a sea of contradictions. The following days passed in a haze. Dad was home, and his presence served as a thin wall between Lillian and me. We avoided each other, as if even a glance could shatter this fragile barrier we had created. But the silence we maintained was deceptive. Inside me, everything was boiling. One evening, Dad decided to stay late at work again. The house was ours alone once more. I tried to avoid Lillian, hiding in my room, but I felt drawn to her, as if an invisible force was pulling me out of my sanctuary. I went downstairs to get some water and saw her in the kitchen. She was sitting at the table with a glass of wine, her gaze directed out the window, but it seemed like she was seeing something far away. Jason, she said, without even turning around. You feel it too, don't you? This tension between us. I feel it, I admitted honestly, tired of fighting myself. She turned to me, her eyes filled with emotions I couldn't decipher. She seemed both vulnerable and determined. I tried to keep my distance, she said, her voice almost a whisper. But every time I look at you, I realize it's impossible. I didn't respond. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the words were stuck in my throat. She stood up, leaving the glass on the table, and walked towards me. We can keep running from each other, but it won't change anything, she said, her voice filled with quiet certainty. What's between us won't go away. Lillian, this is wrong, I mumbled, but my words sounded hollow even to me. If it's wrong, why does it feel so strong? She asked, her voice filled with pain and hope at the same time. She took the final step towards me. Her face was now so close to mine that I could feel her breath. Her hand reached up, and she gently touched my cheek, so tenderly that it was almost unbearable. Tell me you don't want this, she whispered. Tell me, and I'll stop. I wanted to say I didn't want it. I wanted to, but I couldn't. Instead, I silently looked at her, feeling all my inner barriers crumbling. Her lips found mine, and this kiss was different. In it was not only passion but also desperation, a longing we had suppressed for too long. I responded to her kiss, my arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her closer. But at some point I stepped back, breaking the connection between us. We can't keep doing this, I said, my voice trembling. This will destroy us. Jason, this is already destroying us, she said softly. Do you think by avoiding this we can go back to how things were? We can't. We've crossed that line. Later that night, I sat in my room, feeling crushed. I understood that Lillian was right. We couldn't go back. But I also understood that every step forward was leading us to the abyss. Dad returned a few hours later. His presence was like a cold shower, bringing me back to reality. Lillian and I put on our masks again, pretending everything was normal. But I knew it couldn't last long. The next day at dinner, Dad suddenly looked at me. Jason, you've been spending a lot of time with Lillian, haven't you? He asked, his voice casual but his gaze piercing. I felt the world stop. My hands froze on the table, and a cold feeling began to spread in my chest. We're just talking, I said, trying to sound calm. Dad nodded, but his gaze lingered on me longer than usual. I saw Lillian tense, her hand trembling as she lifted her wine glass. That's good, he said, his voice steady, but I felt he suspected something. That night, lying in my bed, I realized that everything was inevitably heading towards a catastrophe. Our actions were too dangerous, too destructive. But no matter how hard I tried to fight it, I knew that stopping would be even harder.